Hey guys, today we're going to take a look at the voice processing recipe for the new Victor update. Here is what he sounds like unprocessed,
Emotion clashes with reason.
and here's what he sounds like processed.
Emotion clashes with reason.
So, this was a somewhat unique work stream for me because I was trying to match some design decisions tied to the television show while also marrying those choices with how League of Legends sounds. And a show and a high octane video game are very different mix spaces. And also, while both both projects share some core audio design philosophies, the aesthetic of each product is also somewhat distinct from one another. So let's dive in. The first thing that I worked on was the show was using something very similar to this absinthe patch. That sounds like here's a before and after.
Emotion clashes with reason. Emotion clashes with reason.
And that's also something similar to this is used in the old bass Victor. So it seemed like a good thing to include in this. But in order to make this really push, I added in some tape saturation from Trash in a multi-band fashion where I could push each band of frequency a lot heavier than I could if I pushed them all together. And here's a before and after. Notice how with the saturation, the absinthe patch really is able to feel full, whereas without it, to me, it sounds kind of bass heavy and just too round.
Emotion clashes with reason. Emotion clashes with reason.
I'll do go one more time. Without,
Emotion clashes with reason.
with,
Emotion clashes with reason.
and then I eventually added in some low cut here to avoid it dominating the low end.
Emotion clashes with reason.
The next thing that I did was starting from this absinthe patch here.
Emotion clashes with reason.
Something similar was used in the arcane processing. And so, if I recall correctly, this was sort of my starting point, and I wanted to use this as my kind of my sub layer. I typically have a core processing layer, a low frequency sub layer, and then a higher frequency layer that maintains intelligibility and identity to the character in their human voice. So, starting off with this,
Emotion clashes with reason.
before the absinthe, I have this pitch delay,
Emotion clashes with reason.
which adds some nice warble crunchiness to it. If we listen to just the pitch delay by itself, notice how it almost has a tremolo effect inside of it,
Emotion clashes with reason. I am not the man I was, but who I wished to be.
or kind of like a ring modulation vibe. So I really dig that. Then running the pitch delay into speakerphone to get some of the maskiness
Emotion clashes with reason.
and that sick resonance. Then going into the absinthe, which we heard,
Emotion clashes with reason.
to just crunch it all together, kind of destroy it a bit, and then cleaning up. It was dominating my mix too much when all the layers were engaged,
Emotion clashes with reason.
and then shrinking that stereo image a bit.
Emotion clashes with reason.
When I have a layer that is really rooting all of my layers together, I like to have its stereo width be quite narrow. It gives a more grounded, stable vibe to the whole track. So let's hear these two tracks together. First, we'll hear just the core track,
Emotion clashes with reason.
and now just the uh, sub track,
Emotion clashes with reason.
now together.
Emotion clashes with reason.
So the core track is dominating most of the mix. The sub track is here just to fill out its low end that it's missing a bit of. And let's go ahead and listen to the core track, and then I'll add in the heavy track.
Emotion clashes with reason. Emotion clashes with reason.
Just thickening it up a bit. But while that stuff sounds kind of cool by itself, in the context of a game, it's hard to understand what he's actually talking about.
I am not the man I was, but who I wished to be.
So adding in some intelligibility here.
I am not the man I was, but who I wished to be.
Without.
I am not the man I was, but who I wished to be.
And with.
I am not the man I was, but who I wished to be.
So that layer was made of just this pitch shift because the other two tracks are already pitch shifting with their absinthe and such. So following in that tradition before.
Emotion clashes with reason.
And after.
Emotion clashes with reason.
But there's a lot of nice grit in his voice, which is cool. But that grit is already being carried by our other two layers. So let's just cut it out here.
Emotion clashes with reason.
And then adding in choral.
Emotion clashes with reason.
To have those nice little metallic rings to them.
I am not the man I was, but who I wished to be.
I usually use choral as more of a reverb type effect, but I wanted to try and make a mask out of it this time because it is a very versatile plugin that's a lot of fun to use. One other quick note is that I typically like to pitch shift before my EQs. Otherwise, it feels like, I don't know. It feels like if you put the pitch, I guess let's see what it sounds like. So this is with EQ before.
I am not the man I was, but who I wished to be.
And after.
I am not the man I was, but who I wished to be.
Well, would you look at that? It sounds almost the same. But I like to pitch shift typically before I'm doing my EQing, because otherwise you have different amounts of frequencies that are getting moved around, and I usually also like to try and keep pitch as close to the very beginning of the signal chain as possible, because as it gets pushed lower and lower, there's less of the core of the human voice that is maintained. And so I like to start with, you've got your dry voice, and then put it in whatever pitch register that voice is aiming to be in, and then start applying additional effects. But in this case, it sounds like it could have gone either direction. So what does all this stuff sound like together?
I am not the man I was, but who I wished to be.
Sounds pretty cool so far, but it's very sterile. And so I want to spruce that up a little bit. Here I'm using choral in a different set of settings, which makes it sound much more echoey. And then after choral, I'm using this reverb to smooth out the harshness of the choral. So here is a before and after.
I am not the man I was, but who I wished to be. I am not the man I was, but who I wished to be.
One of the design elements of Viktor that I was aiming to accomplish is he is wearing a helmet, but he's also magical, but also technological. And so those are three different pillars that all have pretty different directions. So I'm trying to find a way to push his voice into this unique space that swirls a little bit, also has some resonances reflective of or representative of a mask, and has warbly crunchiness, which is sort of the representation of technology here. So that is his voice so far.
Emotion clashes with reason.
But it doesn't have too much magic yet, so that's what these layers are going to do. Let's hear them all together just to start with. So that's what we're trying to build next. So starting off with our impulse response layer, I pretty well always am high passing around 90 because I don't want all that mud to get in. And let's hear what this sounds like. Well, first let's take a listen to this. So what I'm about to play is what I'm using as an impulse response. So that sound that we just heard, I put it inside of this reverb, and now this reverb is pretending that the sound we just heard is a room, and it's trying to apply the vibe of that room to the VO. So here we go.
Emotion clashes with
Nope, let's try again. So that's what Altiverb plugin thinks that that sound effect should sound like when it is smashed into a voice. I have my dry wet at 90%. I like to allow just a tiny bit of the actual voice through. Otherwise, it just gets. It just turns entirely into a sound effect where if you let a tiny bit of the voice through, as it is continued to be morphed and processed down the signal chain, it ties its vibe back to the actual voice. Whereas if you don't let any of it through, it can sometimes start sounding like there is just an entirely unrelated sound effect that is playing in tandem with the core voice. One other thing that sometimes needs to be done is I use this time adjustment delay occasionally, because in this instance, I'm going to play this sound without the time adjustment delay, and you will hear the reverb sound and the core voice are not in sync at all. And that starts to have really long tails, and so bumping it back a little bit puts them in sync a lot better. Next, I chopped a whole lot of the intelligibility layer, or frequencies rather, because I did not want them fighting with the rest of the voice, and his voice is already kind of resonant and shrill. And pushing that down. And then next, we are adding in some of that magical movement. So the IR by itself sounds unique, but it's very static, especially when heard back to back over a number of lines. It doesn't change that much. So next, I'm trying to add as much movement to the pitch and general timbre and vibe of the sound as I can. So here we've got crystallizer. Here's before and after. Mostly it can be heard in the tails, but a little bit in the other parts. And then I'm using sidechain compression and now into a expander, which is not something I do very often. I often will do sidechain compression, which is when the main voice is talking, it is ducking or making quieter this reverb layer so that you can always hear the intelligibility really obviously. And then as the main voice is done talking at the end of a line, the reverb can come up in its volume and fill in the gaps. So that's pretty standard. But I now also have something, an expander, which is as the voice gets quieter, the sound of the reverb will also get quieter. So I essentially have made, I think, what's called an envelope follower, where the volume of the reverb is closely tracking itself to the volume of the main voice. So here is kind of an extreme example of it. First, let's hear just the voice.
the next chord can adapt to any power, even yours.
And now let's hear just that reverb. And let's hear it without the compression and gate. So it lasts way longer at the tail, and also in this middle area where there is a gap, that gap is not respected at all, and the reverb just bleeds over all of it. And as layers start to stack up, it loses clarity, and it just sounds, once again, more like a sound effect playing in tandem with the voice rather than the voice itself. However, there is something that I don't love, which is it sounds kind of choppy. And I think that could be improved, and it will be improved here in a moment. So next, before we get to that, let's take a peek at layer 2 and the reverb. And I'm once again using choral.
Emotion clashes with reason.
It's got some of that robotic vibration. Here, let's pump this up for a sec.
Emotion clashes with reason.
So that can add in a little more roboticness while also marrying the synthetic IR that we had just heard with a more realistic sounding reverb.
Emotion clashes with reason.
But by itself, I don't think the choral quite stands on its own, and so I added in some additional um, some additional delays. With Crystallizer, this time I am not actually changing the pitch, which is typically how this is used. I'm simply reversing the delay taps and putting it about 50%, 60% mix. So that's another element of how a reverb usually sounds. And then lastly, I'm going to smooth it over with this random hall. I really like the random hall setting from this reverb. It's nice and smeary. And then lastly, doing some additional sidechain compression on its own track. So let's hear these guys together. Let's hear just the first. Kind of sterile. Much fuller and has an actual tail. But they're still not all the way glued together in my ears, and they still sound a little unnatural. And thus I put on a little bit of Pro R reverb and another instance of choral at some different values that just kind of bounce around a little bit. And then there is a filter that is sweeping and closing at the end of lines to sort of simulate a mouth shape. So here's before and after. And one place that we can hear the effects of these plugins more so is, remember how choppy this first line sounded? With these plugins engaged, in theory, it should sound a little smoother. There's still a little tick, a little thump when the line is starting up again, but that will be completely masked by the actual syllable of the core voice here when the core voice is playing.
The next core can adapt to any power, even yours.
So that is Viktor's processing.
Emotion clashes with reason.
Thank you for listening.